Previously, through the Amarna letters, we learned about international diplomacy which worked to keep some kind of order among the great powers of the Fertile Crescent and Egypt. But this was all swept away by the inundation of the Sea Peoples. In the subsequent period, no great states dominated the region, and so smaller and weaker states were left in place. Perhaps the most well-known of these smaller states was the Kingdom of the Israelites, which peaked during the reign of King David and his son Solomon from roughly 1000 BCE down to about 930. Note that it was in the interval between the collapse of the great states like Egypt and the Hittites and before the reemergence of such large territorial empires. Here were the small players having their moment in the sun until the varsity team would arrive and again dominate the playing field. This was Assyria. The Assyrians expanded and dominated from the late 10th century BCE down to the late 7th century BCE. The Assyrian heartland was the upper Tigris River. There, with its great cities of Ashur and Nineveh, which became vast and impressive imperial centers. Assyrian power was built in part on iron, using iron weapons, iron armor for its massive infantry force, which was augmented by chariots, and by a cavalry force of mounted archers, all carefully coordinated by commanders who were selected for their effectiveness. The huge Assyrian army could even fight on a year-round campaign basis. It was a war machine that did not pause, and it deployed siege weaponry to scale city walls or batter them down, while their engineers found ways to cross whatever obstacle lay in their path. The empire also invested in infrastructure, building roads to move troops more quickly, and relay stations along the way to ensure swift communication between center and periphery. At the core of the empire was the land of Ashur, which supplied food, soldiers, administrators to rule the lands under the yoke of Ashur, the conquered provinces that paid tribute. Assyrian conquest was fueled by a devotion to the god Ashur, who called the king to expand his authority, conquering in the god's name, and through victory and conquest, ultimately ensuring peace and order. This was a divine mandate for war in order to bring peace. Assyria was the first empire to unite Egypt with the Fertile Crescent. One Assyrian strategy to maintain control was sheer intimidation, which was evident in their historical texts, in their messages to other kings, and in their art, which showed the Assyrian king and army as an unrelenting, unstoppable force, ready to inflict mass violence, to capture women, take children, cattle, all as spoils of war, after massacring and mutilating all those who stood in its way. The Assyrians demonstrated a willingness and even a delight in inflicting utter brutality on any competitor. When the art turns its focus from the field of battle to the king, we have images of massive kings with hand on sword and Assyrian monarchs pursuing a favorite pastime, hunting by fearlessly killing lions, putting wild forces under the yoke of Ashur. Fear of the Assyrians resonated throughout the Near East, and it is well represented in the ancient Israelite texts that were collected in the Bible. Consider, for example, in one of those texts, known as the Book of Jonah, where the Israelite God ordered a man named Jonah to travel to the Assyrian capital of Nineveh to proclaim their destruction. Jonah wisely chose to disobey God and go in the opposite direction, rather than risk stirring the most feared wrath of the Assyrian monarch. Another Assyrian strategy was deportation and forced relocation. Assyrians moved hundreds of thousands of people from one area, from their homeland, to other parts of the empire in order to weaken resistance and increase imperial control. Among those relocated were the tribes of Israel, which Assyria had conquered in the 8th century BCE, relocating those 10 northern tribes to Mesopotamia, where they would eventually disappear from history. The 2 southern tribes, which were in the kingdom of Judah, with their capital at Jerusalem, were able to withstand an Assyrian siege later in the century, thanks to disease that struck the Assyrian army, though the king of Judah paid a heavy tribute nonetheless. By the late 7th century, the Assyrian Empire had overextended its resources, and in 612 BCE, a broad coalition of subject peoples led by the Babylonians and an Indo-European people called the Medes was able, after a great struggle, to seize the Assyrian capital and bring the empire to an end. Review the material on the Assyrian Empire and share what you found.